In the grand theater of human interaction, few forces command as much silent authority as strategic absence. Where presence often dilutes power through familiarity and predictability, absence creates a vacuum that draws others inexorably toward contemplation of what is missing. This phenomenon, understood intuitively by masters of influence throughout history, operates on psychological principles as old as desire itself. The weak man believes his value lies in constant availability, in being the ever-present solution to every problem, the perpetual shoulder for every burden. He mistakes visibility for importance, confusing the temporary gratitude of others with genuine respect. Such a man becomes furniture in the lives of those around him, useful, reliable, but ultimately taken for granted. His presence becomes as unremarkable as the air people breathe, noticed only when suddenly absent. But the man who has destroyed his weak self understands a fundamental truth: scarcity creates value, mystery generates fascination, and strategic withdrawal can accomplish what aggressive pursuit never could. When such a man removes himself from the equation, he does not disappear, he transforms from a known quantity into an enigma that demands resolution. Consider the nature of water and how it shapes even the hardest stone. Water does not attack the rock with violence or force, instead, it withdraws and returns, each absence creating space for the next engagement to penetrate deeper. The power lies not in the water's presence but in its patient, rhythmic withdrawal that leaves the stone forever changed. The first feeling that emerges when a powerful man withdraws is curiosity tinged with unease. Those who had grown accustomed to his predictable presence suddenly find themselves confronted with uncertainty. Where once they could count on his reactions, his availability, his emotional investment, now there exists only silence, a silence that speaks louder than any words he might have offered. This curiosity manifests differently across relationships. The colleague who once relied on his constant input now finds herself checking her phone obsessively, wondering why her messages go unanswered. The friend who took his loyalty for granted begins to question what he might have done wrong. The romantic partner who assumed his devotion was unconditional starts to feel the cold touch of insecurity. The weak man fears this discomfort in others and rushes to fill every silence, to explain every absence, to reassure and comfort and maintain the illusion of his indispensability. But the strong man knows that this discomfort is not a problem to be solved, it is a tool to be wielded with surgical precision. In the absence of his familiar patterns, people begin to construct narratives to fill the void. They wonder about his motivations, his activities, his state of mind. They find themselves thinking about him at unexpected moments, trying to decode the meaning behind his withdrawal. This mental occupation represents the first transfer of power from the present to the absent, from the available to the scarce. The second feeling that surfaces is a peculiar form of respect born from recognition of agency. When a man can walk away, truly walk away, not as a manipulation or a threat, but as a genuine expression of his sovereignty over his own time and energy, others are forced to confront the reality that his presence in their lives is a choice, not an obligation. This realization carries profound implications. The weak man's presence carries no weight because it seems involuntary, driven by need, desperation, or lack of alternatives. His attention feels cheap because it appears unlimited and unconditional. But, when a man demonstrates through his absence that his engagement is voluntary and selective, suddenly, his presence becomes precious. The colleague realizes that his contributions were not the desperate offerings of someone with no other options, but the deliberate investments of someone who chose to engage. The friend understands that his loyalty was not born from social anxiety or lack of other friendships, but from genuine selection. The romantic partner grasps that his affection was not the clingy attachment of someone who feared abandonment, but the conscious choice of someone who could thrive independently. This recognition of voluntary engagement elevates the absent man in their estimation. They begin to see him not as someone who needs them, but as someone who might choose them, a far more intoxicating proposition. The dynamic shifts from one of expectation to one of hope, from entitlement to gratitude. The third emotion that emerges is longing, that bittersweet ache for something that once was readily available but now seems beyond reach. Longing is fundamentally different from missing someone in the conventional sense. Missing implies temporary separation with expected reunion. Longing carries uncertainty, the possibility that what is gone may not return, at least not in the same form. The weak man generates no longing because his return is always assumed. His absence, when it occurs, feels like a temporary inconvenience rather than a meaningful loss. His patterns are so predictable, his dedication so reliable, that others never truly face the prospect of his permanent withdrawal. But, when a man who has mastered himself steps away, he takes with him not just his physical presence but the comfort of certainty. Others find themselves confronted with questions they never had to consider. What if he doesn't come back? What if he has found something or someone better? What if his absence is permanent? This longing manifests in unexpected ways. The colleague finds herself remembering conversations differently, focusing on moments of connection rather than taking his input for granted. The friend begins to appreciate memories that once seemed ordinary, recognizing qualities in their relationship that he had previously overlooked. The romantic partner discovers that experiences shared with him had a richness that becomes apparent only in retrospect. Longing has the curious effect of idealization. In his absence, his flaws become endearing quirks, his limitations become acceptable trade-offs, and his positive qualities become magnified. This is not delusion but recognition, the clarity that comes when someone is no longer taken for granted. The fourth feeling that surfaces is anxiety, a restless uncertainty about the future of the relationship and one's place in his world. This anxiety stems from the sudden awareness that they may have undervalued what they had and might not be able to recover it. Anxiety in this context is productive emotion. It motivates reflection, drives behavioral change, and creates openness to growth. The colleague begins to question whether she appreciated his contributions sufficiently, whether she took credit for successes that should have been shared, whether she responded to his ideas with the respect they deserved. The friend starts to examine his own patterns of reciprocity, wondering if he gave as much as he received, supported as much as he was supported. The romantic partner faces uncomfortable truths about her own behavior, her assumptions, her level of genuine investment in his happiness. This anxiety is not the neurotic worry of the insecure but the healthy concern of someone who recognizes they may have taken something valuable for granted. It creates space for genuine appreciation and motivates the kind of behavioral changes that weak men try to force through argument, ultimatum, or manipulation. The weak man attempts to create anxiety through threats, emotional blackmail, or dramatic proclamations. But artificial anxiety breeds resentment and resistance. Natural anxiety, born from the simple recognition that someone valuable might genuinely choose to leave, creates motivation for authentic change. The fifth emotion that emerges is relief, though this might seem counterintuitive. Relief comes from the release of pressure, from the lifting of expectations, from the freedom to act without consideration of his reactions or needs. This relief is temporary but significant, representing a necessary stage in the process of recognition. During periods of relief, people often experience a burst of energy and freedom. The colleague throws herself into projects without worrying about his input. The friend makes social plans without considering his preferences. The romantic partner enjoys activities that he didn't share or appreciate. This phase of relief serves multiple purposes. It allows others to rediscover their own agency and independence, preventing the development of unhealthy dependence. It also provides contrast, making clear what aspects of life improve in his absence and what aspects suffer. The wise man who withdraws understands that this relief is not rejection but recalibration. People need space to rediscover their own strength and autonomy before they can properly appreciate voluntary partnership. The weak man interprets signs of relief as evidence that his presence was unwanted, leading to resentment or desperate attempts to reassert his importance. But the strong man knows that relief inevitably transforms into other emotions as people adjust to their new reality. The initial burst of freedom gives way to a more complex emotional landscape as they begin to process what his absence truly means. The sixth feeling that develops is gratitude, a deep appreciation for what he brought to their lives that becomes apparent only through its absence. This gratitude is qualitatively different from the superficial thanks people offer for immediate favors or obvious benefits. It represents genuine recognition of value that was previously invisible or taken for granted. The colleague begins to notice how much smoother projects ran with his input, how his perspective prevented costly mistakes, how his presence elevated the quality of discussions. The friend realizes how much stability and wisdom he provided, how his loyalty created a foundation of trust that allowed for greater vulnerability and growth. The romantic partner recognizes how his strength allowed her to be vulnerable, how his consistency created space for her own growth, how his love made her feel worthy and desirable. This gratitude cannot be forced or demanded. It emerges naturally from the contrast between having and not having, between the richness of his presence and the emptiness of his absence. The weak man tries to cultivate gratitude through constant reminders of his sacrifices, through keeping score of his contributions, through emotional manipulation designed to make others feel guilty for their lack of appreciation. But genuine gratitude comes from understanding, not guilt. It grows from recognition, not obligation. When people truly understand what they had, appreciation flows naturally and abundantly. The seventh and final feeling that emerges is desperation, though this word requires careful definition. This is not the frantic desperation of the needy but the focused urgency of someone who recognizes they may lose something irreplaceable. It is the desperation of the merchant who discovers he has undervalued a rare gem, of the art collector who realizes a piece he overlooked is actually a masterwork. This desperation manifests as a willingness to change, to grow, to do what is necessary to create conditions for his potential return. The colleague begins to restructure her approach to collaboration, creating space for his contributions and demonstrating genuine respect for his expertise. The friend examines his own patterns of friendship, working to become the kind of person worthy of such loyalty. The romantic partner faces her own limitations and begins the difficult work of becoming someone capable of truly appreciating what he offered. This desperation is productive because it comes from recognition rather than fear. People are not desperate to avoid punishment or manipulation but to reconnect with something they now understand to be valuable. They are not driven by what they might lose but by what they recognize they already lost through their own inattention. The man who has destroyed his weak self understands that these 7 emotions, curiosity, respect, longing, anxiety, relief, gratitude, and desperation, represent a complete cycle of recognition. Each emotion serves a purpose in helping others understand what they had, what they lost, and what they might be able to recover through their own growth. He does not withdraw to punish or manipulate but to create space for this natural process of recognition. He understands that his true value cannot be demonstrated through his presence but only through his absence, cannot be argued but only discovered, cannot be demanded but only earned through the quality of what he offers when he chooses to engage. Part 2, The Alchemy of Self-Destruction. The transformation from weak to strong requires a peculiar kind of violence, not the external violence of physical confrontation but the internal violence of systematic self-destruction. The man who would wield the power of absence must first destroy every part of himself that needs external validation, that fears abandonment, that seeks comfort in the predictable patterns of weakness. This destruction is not the dramatic collapse of a single moment but the methodical dismantling of years of conditioning, the careful excavation of authentic self from beneath layers of learned helplessness, people-pleasing, and fear-based behavior. It requires the courage to face the void where certainty once lived and the wisdom to understand that this void is not emptiness but potential. The weak man builds his identity around his relationships, his usefulness to others, his ability to meet needs and solve problems. His sense of self rises and falls with the approval he receives, the gratitude he generates, the indispensability he imagines he has created. When others are pleased with him, he feels valuable. When they are indifferent or critical, he feels worthless. This external locus of control makes him predictable, manipulable, and ultimately powerless. To destroy this weak self, a man must first recognize the cage he has built around his own potential. He must see clearly how his need for approval has made him a slave to the moods and preferences of others, how his fear of abandonment has led him to abandon himself, how his desire to be needed has made him needy. This recognition often comes through pain. Perhaps the colleague he supported unconditionally takes credit for his work. Perhaps the friend he always prioritized abandons him when he needs support. Perhaps the partner he devoted himself to leaves him for someone who treats her with indifference. These moments of betrayal or abandonment, while painful, offer the gift of clarity. They reveal the futility of building identity on external foundations. The first element to be destroyed is the belief that his value lies in his usefulness. The weak man measures his worth by his productivity, his problem-solving ability, his capacity to meet the needs of others. He becomes a human tool, defined by his function rather than his essence. This utilitarian self-concept inevitably leads to exploitation, as others learn to see him as a resource rather than a person. Destroying this belief requires the difficult work of separating being from doing, of finding value in existence rather than function. The man must learn to say no, not out of spite or manipulation but from genuine sovereignty over his time and energy. He must practice being present without being productive, engaging without being useful, existing without justifying his existence. This process feels like death because in many ways it is death, the death of a false self that depended on external validation for its existence. The man may experience periods of emptiness, confusion, and fear as he learns to exist without the familiar patterns of productivity and usefulness that once defined him. The second element to be destroyed is the need for immediate reciprocity in relationships. The weak man keeps careful score, ensuring that every favor is returned, every kindness matched, every investment repaid. This transactional approach to relationships reduces human connection to commerce, creating a sterile environment where genuine affection cannot flourish. To destroy this pattern, the man must learn to give without expectation, to invest without guarantee, to love without requiring love in return. This does not mean becoming a doormat or allowing exploitation, but rather understanding that true generosity flows from abundance rather than need, from strength rather than weakness. This transformation requires developing internal abundance, the deep knowing that his value does not depend on what others give him in return. He must cultivate interests, passions, and purposes that exist independently of his relationships, creating a rich inner life that makes him interesting rather than needy. The third element to be destroyed is the compulsion to explain himself, to justify his decisions, to seek permission for his choices. The weak man lives in a constant state of apology, forever explaining his actions to an imaginary tribunal of others whose approval he desperately seeks. This pattern makes him predictable and gives others power over his decisions. The strong man makes choices based on his own values and judgment, then implements them without elaborate justification. He understands that explaining decisions often weakens them, that justifying choices invites negotiation where none should exist, that seeking permission for his own life grants others authority they have not earned. Destroying the compulsion to explain requires developing comfort with misunderstanding, disapproval, and criticism. The man must learn that not everyone will understand his choices, that some people will disapprove of his decisions, that criticism is inevitable and largely irrelevant. He must practice making choices and implementing them without elaborate preambles or justifications. This process often feels lonely because it represents a fundamental shift from external to internal authority. The man can no longer rely on others to validate his decisions or make him feel secure about his choices. He must develop the internal strength to stand alone with his convictions. The fourth element to be destroyed is the fear of loss that drives desperate holding patterns. The weak man clings to relationships, opportunities, and situations long past their expiration date because he fears that letting go means having nothing. This fear makes him tolerate disrespect, accept mediocrity, and remain in situations that diminish him. The strong man understands that holding too tightly often ensures loss, that desperation repels what it seeks to attract, that the willingness to lose everything is often the key to having everything worth having. He develops what might be called strategic detachment, the ability to care deeply while remaining willing to walk away. This requires cultivating alternatives not as backup plans but as expressions of his multifaceted nature. The man develops interests, relationships, and pursuits that exist independently of any single connection or opportunity. This abundance mindset eliminates the scarcity thinking that drives desperate behavior. The fifth element to be destroyed is the addiction to comfort, safety, and predictability that keeps men trapped in patterns that no longer serve them. The weak man chooses security over growth, comfort over challenge, the known over the unknown. This preference for safety gradually erodes his capacity for greatness, reducing him to a cautious observer of his own life. The strong man deliberately chooses discomfort, seeks challenges that test his limits, and embraces uncertainty as the price of growth. He understands that safety is largely illusion, that comfort often signals stagnation, that predictability can be a prison of his own construction. This requires developing what could be called anti-fragility, the capacity not just to survive disruption but to grow stronger from it. The man learns to see obstacles as opportunities, setbacks as information, failures as education. He cultivates resilience not by avoiding difficulty but by repeatedly choosing to face challenges that stretch his capabilities. The sixth and, perhaps most crucial element to be destroyed is the need to be right, to win arguments, to prove his superiority through debate or competition. The weak man measures his worth by his ability to demonstrate his intelligence, correctness, or moral superiority. This need makes him argumentative, defensive, and, ultimately unattractive to others who sense his insecurity beneath the intellectual display. The strong man has no need to prove his worth through argument because his worth is not in question, at least not by him. He can be wrong without feeling worthless, can lose debates without losing face, can admit ignorance without feeling inadequate. This freedom from the need to be right makes him paradoxically more influential because others feel safe around him. Destroying the need to be right requires developing genuine confidence, not the brittle confidence of the insecure who must constantly prove themselves, but the quiet confidence of someone who knows his own value. This comes through competence, through real achievement, through the accumulation of evidence that he can handle whatever life presents. The final element to be destroyed is perhaps the most subtle but also the most important, the belief that he can control how others feel about him. The weak man exhausts himself trying to manage others' emotions, to prevent their disappointment, to ensure their approval. This impossible task dooms him to failure and frustration while making him responsible for emotions that are not his to control. The strong man understands that others' feelings about him are information about them, not verdicts about him. He cannot control whether someone appreciates him, but he can control whether he is worth appreciating. He cannot ensure that others love him, but he can ensure that he is lovable. He cannot prevent disappointment or disapproval, but he can remain centered regardless of others' reactions. This final destruction, the release of responsibility for others' emotions, completes the transformation from weak to strong. The man who no longer needs others to feel a certain way about him is free to be authentic, to make difficult decisions, to disappoint when necessary, and to maintain his integrity regardless of external pressure. The process of destroying the weak self is not a one-time event but an ongoing practice. The patterns of weakness are deeply ingrained, reinforced by years of conditioning and social pressure. They will reassert themselves during times of stress, loneliness, or uncertainty. The strong man remains vigilant, consistently choosing strength over weakness, authenticity over approval, sovereignty over security. This destruction creates space for the emergence of his authentic self, not the self that has been crafted to please others or meet their needs, but the self that exists independently of external validation. This authentic self has preferences that are not negotiable, standards that are not flexible, and boundaries that are not permeable. The man who has completed this process of self-destruction cannot be destroyed by others because there is nothing left in him that depends on their approval for its existence. His confidence comes from competence, his security from self-knowledge, his worth from internal rather than external sources. He becomes, quite literally, indestructible in the ways that matter most. When such a man withdraws, he does so not from weakness but from strength, not from fear but from choice, not from need but from abundance. His absence carries weight because his presence had substance. Others feel his withdrawal acutely because they had something real to lose. Part 3, The Invulnerable Man. The culmination of destroying one's weak self is not the emergence of hardness or cruelty, but the birth of genuine invulnerability, a state where external circumstances cannot diminish one's essential nature, where others' opinions cannot shake one's foundation, where loss cannot destroy one's capacity for joy and growth. This invulnerability is not the brittle armor of the defensive but the fluid strength of water, which yields to pressure yet maintains its essential nature regardless of the container it fills. The invulnerable man has learned the deepest secret of human psychology: that which we fear to lose controls us, and that which we can release freely serves us. He has methodically eliminated every point of leverage that others might use to manipulate or control him, not through becoming cold or uncaring, but through developing such rich internal resources that external circumstances lose their power to dictate his emotional state. This invulnerability manifests first in his relationship with material things. The weak man defines himself through his possessions, his status symbols, his accumulation of objects that signal his worth to others. He fears poverty not for the practical challenges it might bring but for the shame he imagines it would cause, the loss of face, the reduction in others' estimation of his value. The invulnerable man understands that possessions are tools, not identities. He may enjoy material comfort and work to achieve it, but he does not confuse having with being. He knows that his worth exists independently of his net worth, that his identity transcends his accessories, that his value cannot be calculated on any balance sheet. This freedom from material attachment allows him to take risks that more cautious men cannot consider. He can walk away from lucrative but soul-crushing work because his identity is not tied to his salary. He can refuse compromises that violate his principles because his self-respect is worth more than any paycheck. He can invest in long-term goals that may not pay immediate dividends because his confidence does not depend on others' recognition of his success. When others attempt to influence him through material incentives or threats, they discover that such leverage has no power over someone who truly understands that he owns his possessions rather than being owned by them. The colleague who tries to pressure him with promises of promotion finds that his decision-making is not for sale. The friend who attempts to buy his loyalty with expensive gifts learns that his friendship cannot be purchased. The partner who thinks financial security will ensure his commitment discovers that his love is not a transaction. The second manifestation of invulnerability appears in his relationship with social status and reputation. The weak man lives in constant fear of social embarrassment, of losing face, of being judged harshly by others. This fear makes him careful, conventional, and ultimately forgettable as he shapes himself to meet others' expectations rather than expressing his authentic nature. The invulnerable man has made peace with disapproval. He understands that being misunderstood is the price of being interesting, that being criticized is the cost of having opinions, that being judged is inevitable and largely irrelevant. He has learned that the opinions of those who do not know him intimately are simply data points with no bearing on his actual worth. This freedom from social anxiety allows him to be genuinely himself in all situations. He does not modify his personality based on his audience, does not tell people what he thinks they want to hear, does not suppress his genuine thoughts and feelings to maintain social harmony. This authenticity is both attractive and intimidating to others, who often live in constant compromise with their own truth. When others attempt to control him through social pressure, threatening to damage his reputation, withdraw their approval, or expose his flaws to others, they find that such threats carry no weight with someone who has already made peace with human judgment. The colleague who tries to embarrass him in meetings discovers that he cannot be shamed into compliance. The friend who attempts to manipulate him through gossip or social exclusion learns that he values his integrity more than their acceptance. The partner who threatens to tell others about his faults finds that he has no secret shame requiring protection. The third aspect of invulnerability emerges in his relationship with emotional pain and loss. The weak man structures his entire existence around avoiding discomfort, preventing loss, and maintaining emotional equilibrium. This avoidance makes him fragile, as he has never developed the capacity to endure pain without being broken by it. The invulnerable man has walked through fire and discovered that he does not burn, not because he is immune to pain, but because he has learned that pain is temporary while the strength gained from surviving it is permanent. He has faced his deepest fears and found them to be less terrible than the anxiety of avoiding them. He has lost things he thought he could not live without and discovered not only that he could survive, but that he could thrive. This emotional resilience gives him tremendous freedom. He can love deeply without the desperate clinging that destroys relationships. He can invest fully in projects that might fail because failure has lost its power to devastate him. He can be vulnerable with others because vulnerability no longer feels like a threat to his essential self. When others attempt to control him through emotional manipulation, threatening abandonment, withdrawal of love, or infliction of emotional pain, they discover that these tactics have no power over someone who has already faced his worst fears and survived. The colleague who tries to pressure him through emotional blackmail finds that he cannot be guilted into compliance. The friend who attempts to control him through threats of abandonment learns that he values authentic connection over fearful attachment. The partner who tries to manipulate him through emotional drama discovers that he will not sacrifice his peace for the illusion of security. The fourth dimension of invulnerability appears in his relationship with time and mortality. The weak man lives in constant anxiety about wasting time, missing opportunities, aging, and dying. This fear makes him frantic, impatient, and ultimately ineffective as he tries to control the uncontrollable passage of time. The invulnerable man has made peace with his mortality. He understands that his time is limited not as a source of anxiety but as a source of focus. He knows that he cannot control how much time he has but can control how fully he uses the time available to him. He has learned to be present rather than constantly worrying about the future or regretting the past. This temporal freedom allows him to move at his own pace, to invest in long-term goals that may not pay immediate dividends, to be patient with processes that cannot be rushed. He is neither desperate to prove himself quickly nor complacent about the time he has remaining. He understands that mastery requires time, that deep relationships develop slowly, that meaningful achievements often demand years of patient effort. When others attempt to pressure him through artificial time constraints or urgency, demanding immediate decisions, threatening that opportunities will disappear, or suggesting that he is running out of time, they find that these tactics have no power over someone who has already accepted the fundamental uncertainty of existence. The colleague who tries to force hasty decisions finds that he will not be rushed into poor choices. The friend who attempts to create urgency around social opportunities learns that he will not sacrifice quality for speed. The partner who threatens that she might not wait for him discovers that he will not be blackmailed by artificial deadlines. The fifth aspect of invulnerability manifests in his relationship with his own principles and values. The weak man holds his beliefs tentatively, ready to modify them based on social pressure, personal advantage, or the convenience of the moment. This flexibility makes him unreliable and, ultimately untrustworthy, even to himself. The invulnerable man has tested his principles under pressure and found them solid. He has paid prices for his convictions and decided they were worth the cost. He has faced situations where compromising his values would have been profitable or convenient, and chosen integrity over advantage. His principles are not theoretical positions but battle-tested realities. This moral clarity gives him tremendous strength in difficult situations. He does not waste energy on internal debates about right and wrong because he has already done the hard work of defining his values. He does not second-guess decisions that align with his principles because he trusts the foundation from which they spring. He does not fear the consequences of moral courage because he has already counted the cost and found it acceptable. When others attempt to corrupt or compromise him, offering rewards for ethical flexibility or threatening punishment for moral rigidity, they discover that these appeals have no power over someone who has already chosen his values over his comfort. The colleague who tries to involve him in unethical practices finds that he cannot be bought or intimidated. The friend who attempts to pressure him into betraying confidences learns that his integrity is not negotiable. The partner who wants him to compromise his principles for her convenience discovers that his character is not subject to revision. The sixth dimension of invulnerability appears in his relationship with love and connection. The weak man approaches relationships from scarcity, believing that love is rare, that good partners are hard to find, that he must compromise his authentic self to maintain connection with others. This scarcity mindset makes him clingy, jealous, and ultimately unattractive to those he most desires. The invulnerable man approaches relationships from abundance. He knows that there are many people in the world capable of appreciating his authentic self, that genuine connection cannot be forced or faked, that the right relationships will enhance rather than diminish his essential nature. He is willing to be alone rather than accept relationships that require him to betray himself. This abundance mindset allows him to love without attachment, to care without clinging, to invest without desperation. He can be fully present in relationships because he is not constantly worried about losing them. He can be generous with his affection because he knows that real love multiplies when shared rather than diminishing when given. When others attempt to control him through threats to the relationship, threatening to leave, to withdraw love, or to find someone else, they discover that these threats have no power over someone who values authentic connection more than fearful attachment. The colleague who tries to control him through workplace politics finds that he will not sacrifice his integrity for professional security. The friend who attempts to manipulate him through social pressure learns that he values genuine friendship over convenient alliance. The partner who threatens abandonment discovers that he will not be held hostage by fear of being alone. The seventh and final aspect of invulnerability emerges in his relationship with his own identity and purpose. The weak man defines himself through external roles and relationships. He is successful when others think he is successful, valuable when others find him useful, worthy when others approve of him. This external definition makes his identity fragile and constantly in need of validation. The invulnerable man has discovered his essential self beneath all the roles he plays and relationships he maintains. He knows who he is independent of what he does, how others perceive him, or what circumstances he finds himself in. His identity is rooted in his character, his values, his authentic nature rather than in external validation or achievement. This inner knowledge gives him unshakable confidence. He does not need others to tell him who he is because he knows himself intimately. He does not need external validation because he has developed internal authority. He does not need others' approval because he has learned to approve of himself based on his alignment with his own values and standards. When others attempt to undermine his confidence through criticism, comparison, or attempts to redefine him according to their preferences, they discover that these efforts have no power over someone who knows himself thoroughly. The colleague who tries to diminish him through professional criticism finds that his confidence does not depend on others' opinions. The friend who attempts to control him through unfavorable comparisons learns that he does not measure himself against others. The partner who tries to reshape him according to her preferences discovers that he will not sacrifice his authentic self for anyone's approval. The man who has achieved this level of invulnerability cannot be destroyed by others because there is nothing external that his well-being depends upon. His happiness comes from internal sources, his confidence from self-knowledge, his security from his own competence and character. He has become like water, maintaining his essential nature regardless of the container he finds himself in, yielding when necessary without losing his identity, powerful in his very adaptability. This invulnerability is not coldness or disconnection but, rather the ultimate freedom to connect authentically. Because he needs nothing from others, he can give freely. Because he fears no loss, he can love deeply. Because he cannot be controlled, he can choose his engagements based on genuine desire rather than fearful obligation. When such a man withdraws, his absence carries the weight of genuine choice. Others feel it acutely because they recognize, perhaps unconsciously, that they are in the presence of someone who cannot be manipulated, controlled, or taken for granted. His withdrawal is not a strategy but an expression of his sovereignty, the natural movement of someone who belongs first and always to himself. The power of his absence lies not in what others lose when he is gone, but in what they recognize they never truly had: the illusion of control over someone who cannot be controlled, the fantasy of taking for granted someone who gives only by choice, the comfortable assumption that his presence was guaranteed rather than gifted. In recognizing this, they begin to understand the difference between the weak man who stays because he has no choice and the strong man who chooses to stay because he values what is being built together. They learn to distinguish between the needy attention of someone desperate for validation and the selective engagement of someone who has much to offer but no need to offer it. This understanding transforms relationships from transactions based on need into voluntary associations based on mutual value creation. The invulnerable man's very presence becomes a gift rather than an expectation, his attention a choice rather than an obligation, his love a blessing rather than a guarantee. And, in this transformation, everyone involved discovers what authentic relationship actually feels like, not the desperate clinging of mutual neediness, but the joyful dance of two complete beings choosing to create something together that neither could achieve alone. The man who cannot be destroyed by others becomes, paradoxically, the greatest gift he can give to those worthy of his authentic self. In the end, the greatest power lies not in the ability to attract others through desperation or manipulation, but in the freedom to withdraw when circumstances no longer serve one's highest good. The man who has destroyed his weak self and achieved true invulnerability discovers that he no longer needs to use the power of absence as a strategy. It becomes simply the natural expression of someone who belongs completely to himself and chooses his engagements from abundance rather than scarcity. In this state, his very presence becomes transformative, not because he seeks to change others, but because authentic strength naturally elevates everything it touches.